Welcome back, everybody. It's time to start the afternoon sessions, and it's my pleasure to introduce two outstanding postdoctoral fellows at the DeGroote Centre for Medicinal Cannabis Research and the Peter Borer Centre for Addictions Research. Dr. Amanda Doggett and Dr. Andre McDonald will be presenting empirical findings from two of our cohort studies happening locally. What we're going to do is have Amanda present a set of findings, followed by Andre present a set of findings, and then Amanda will follow up with a second set of findings. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for open questions at the end. But let's get started. Amanda, would you like to join? Welcome. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for the introduction, James. So my name's Amanda, and I'm a postdoc at the DeGroote Centre for Medicinal Cannabis Research, as well as the Peter Borer Centre for Addictions Research. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a project looking at cannabis use frequency and related consequences over legalization. Oh, and this works now. So this study that I'm going to talk to you about right now was actually published not 2 weeks ago. So if you want to read the full study, there's a link there. I'm going to be giving a really high level overview today, but there's a lot more detail and there's like fun visualizations in the full paper, so I do encourage you to check that out. To give you a little bit of background, which I'll breeze over because I think it's been said a lot today, of course, Canada legalized cannabis for recreational use, coming on 5 years now. The kind of odd thing is that research is still actually pretty sparse when you look into it in terms of the kind of epidemiological patterns of use frequency and related outcomes. And something we know is that emerging adults tend to actually have the highest rate of substance use when we look at the general population. And they also tend to have the highest rates of substance use disorders, and they tend to use substances concurrently. So they kind of represent this higher risk group in the population. And we wanted to look at the impact of legalization on this group because the idea is that if legalization was going to cause kind of these increases in use because of normalization or increased access, all of the things that we thought might happen 5 years ago, we would probably see it happen in this kind of higher risk subgroup of the population. A note about previous research, we've seen some kind of graphs and stuff today, and I'm sure you've seen previous research on legalization before. I want to highlight that what I'm going to be talking to you about today, and what Andre will be showing as well, is a little bit different because it's longitudinal data. So we're looking at the same people followed over time. We see a lot of legalization studies that focused on kind of repeat cross-sectional, or they'll just show like prevalence rates over time, which is great, but we really need longitudinal data to kind of contextualize these findings and measure within the same people so that we know what's really happening. To give you a brief overview, James mentioned this morning the Beta H cohort study. That's what we used for this particular study that I'm talking about right now. We reorganized the time points a little bit, so we had 7 time points spanning across legalization, 2 of which were pre-legalization. I want to highlight how important that is. A lot of cannabis research kind of started data collection like October of 2017 when cannabis was legalized, but we do have pre-legalization time points, which is important for us to be able to see whether or not the trends that we saw pre-legalization kind of match the trends that we see post-legalization, or whether they're different. That's essentially what this study was trying to determine. Again, we had emerging adults at baseline, so like roughly 19 to 23, and they were already engaging in substance use at enrollment of the study. So they were either engaging in heavy episodic drinking a couple times a month, or they were heavy episodic drinkers and also engaging in cannabis use. To kind of put things into context, at baseline, 65% of our sample reported past month cannabis use. Our 2 measures that we were interested in tracking over time were cannabis use frequency, that's measured via the assist, so not kind of use, no use, but we wanted to actually look at frequency, and then cannabis use consequences. So this is just based on a questionnaire of people reporting kind of the number of problems they experienced that were related to cannabis. It's kind of like a sum score. In terms of analysis, we did linear mixed models. So again, this is within person changes over time. And then we also looked at moderating effects. So we looked at the moderating effects of sex, income, education, and then pre-legalization use category. So again, I'm going to go over kind of very high level findings. What did we find? This graph shows the overall change in cannabis use frequency over legalization. That dotted line is legalization. So it looks pretty flat. I want to highlight this is mean frequency, so mean cannabis use frequency over that assist scale. And you can see from this that cannabis use was only really significantly different after legalization at time 7, which is October 2019 to February 2020. That's time 7. That's significantly different from pre-legalization, significantly lower. Not saying that legalization reduced cannabis use. I'll explain this finding in a second. Makes more sense when we put it into context that how people were using pre-legalization. So this is our significant interaction between time and pre-legalization use. You can see the dark green line on the top there represents people using most frequently at enrollment, pre-legalization. And they significantly decrease their use over time, from time 5 to time 7. Those are all significantly different from pre-legalization. And same pattern with our regular use category as well, decreasing their use over time. Now, that's not to say that we think legalization decreased cannabis use. Actually, these are patterns we would have expected to see in this population. As emerging adults get older, they tend to kind of age out of these heavier substance use behaviors. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. So this is more kind of like in spite of legalization, we're still seeing the aging out patterns that we might have expected. The yellow line there, you'll notice that one goes up. That is people who were not using cannabis pre-legalization. And you do actually see an increase, a significantly different increase post-legalization, but it also started before legalization happened too. You can see that it was actually significant at time 3. So we do see an increase in that group, albeit kind of a small increase. And I'd like to kind of contextualize these findings by talking about consequences, which is the other measure that I mentioned. So this is the cannabis use consequences measure. This was also decreased over time, not surprising. This matches kind of the aging out patterns that we would have expected. And then when we split this up by pre-legalization use category, kind of supports what we saw with frequency. People who were using most frequently or regularly on that assist scale, significant decrease in cannabis-related consequences over time. You'll notice, however, though, that the yellow line, even though they increased significantly in frequency, they didn't see a kind of a corresponding significant increase in cannabis-related consequences, which kind of suggests to us that even though there was that uptick in use, it wasn't kind of problematic uptick in use. But definitely still a group that we would want to continue to monitor over time. Because as everyone's alluded to and Dave alluded to earlier, this is kind of a long-term question, right? That I'm showing you quite a bit of data here, but policy change-wise, this is kind of still in very early stages. So population level surveillance, very, very important for these types of questions, and we'll definitely continue to keep looking at this. To give you, it's a little bit weird, but to give you the takeaways here, cannabis legalization didn't really appear to markedly influence cannabis use frequency or problems in our particular sample. And again, highlighting that these are within-person changes. But we really do still need to keep monitoring this group, as I mentioned. I'll go back and I'll probably keep repeating myself over all of my presentations that I'm doing for this conference, the importance of longitudinal data to answer these types of questions. This was the kind of first longitudinal study to look at emerging adults over legalization in Canada. And this kind of stuff can be really helpful for other jurisdictions. Dave alluded to this, other jurisdictions are looking at legalizing cannabis. It's really useful to have kind of this within-person design, which is methodologically robust, that we can actually use to kind of look at whether or not legalization changes people's patterns of use over time. So if this was kind of a few months ago, I might have ended my presentation there, but there is actually a little bit more. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, really the only way for us to conclude that legalization did or didn't change anything is we need a comparison, because we saw the aging out trends that we would have expected, but that doesn't necessarily mean that legalization didn't change anything. Maybe the trend would have been steeper in absence of legalization. We can't really know that unless we have a control group. So kind of enter the complementary study in Memphis, Tennessee, which is not identical, obviously, to the study sample that we used, but in terms of outcomes, similar measures. The problem, though, is that obviously Memphis is quite different from Hamilton, Ontario, and the characteristics are quite dissimilar. So we need to do a few kind of fancy math things to make this comparison actually compatible. And one of those things that we did for this project was propensity score weighting. So we needed to balance the dissimilar characteristics in the study samples. And for those interested, this was inverse probability weighting that we did. And if I was kind of to give you the Coles notes on propensity scores, the dark blue is the unadjusted, and the distance from the middle is just how different the samples were, right? So the very top one that says distance, you can see that the dark blue is like all the way over here. So the samples were quite different, kind of based on the characteristics. And this is not surprising. The age was different in the study samples, and that's just because of enrollment criteria. There was a lot more Black individuals in Memphis, Tennessee. Again, none of these are really unexpected, but they are things that we need to adjust for. So the blue, the light blue, is our adjusted sample. So after that inverse probability weighting, we adjust, and it's much closer to equitable between the two samples. So I'll show you now, this is the trends. Light blue is Hamilton, dark blue is Memphis. And it kind of looks, this is the raw data, it kind of looks like Memphis had a steeper aging out pattern. But we haven't controlled yet for those differences in characteristics, because maybe it's just steeper because of that age difference, maybe it's steeper because of the demographic differences. So combined with our propensity score analysis, I won't bore you too much with the math, but we did a difference in difference approach, which is kind of a really methodologically robust way to compare two different samples and see if there's an impact of a policy change. So after we did kind of this difference in difference approach combined with our propensity score approach, what we found is this. So this graph is showing the kind of difference between the two samples, and anytime they cross zero, there's no difference between the two samples. But you can see at time 6, post 6 is what we've labeled it, there actually was a difference, and Hamilton was a little bit higher in their cannabis use frequency. So about 0.6 units, so not substantial, and you'll notice it goes back down to no difference between the samples at time 7. But it's really interesting that, you know, the first study I presented to you, we kind of said, okay, expected patterns. When we enter this control group, we get a little bit more context, and we find that actually there was a little bit of a difference. And seeing this trend, again, definitely worth continuing to monitor this over time. And these findings are kind of a follow-up to the paper that I mentioned that was published earlier, so stay kind of tuned for that. But yes, thank you for listening to my presentation, and I will hand it over to Andre, who's going to give you a little bit more context into behavior change over legalization.
Okay, so following up on Amanda's presentation, I will be talking about another study that we're doing with a different cohort study, and the title is Changes in Cannabis Use Frequency and Adverse Outcomes Following Recreational Cannabis Legalization, Findings from the PathCan Observational Cohort Study. So Amanda did a pretty good job of setting this up, so I don't have to go too much in depth here. Just to say that evidence is mixed about whether legalization has had a pronounced impact on cannabis use and cannabis-related problems. There are some studies suggesting increase, mostly among adults, others a decrease, and others no significant change. You can find whatever supporting evidence you want. Most previous studies have used a repeated cross-sectional study design, which Amanda alluded to. Which doesn't allow for that within-person change over time. And few longitudinal studies, Amanda's was the first, this could be one of the second for, in a national Canadian, not national, but in a Canadian jurisdiction. So the primary aims were to examine whether cannabis use frequency or cannabis use problems have changed since legalization. Also to examine whether changes were moderated by baseline cannabis use frequency, age, and/or sex. The secondary aim was to characterize changes in cannabis product preferences following legalization among active cannabis users. And so, similar to Amanda's, this is a description of a new cohort. So the PathCan cohort started with a baseline survey in September 2018 and has been ongoing with follow-ups every 6 months since. And for this study, the final sample size was 1,429, and the population is a bit different. So this is 18 to 65 with a grade 9 education, no inpatient psychiatric disorders, and at least 3 observations to try to get that pre-post. The 2 continuous outcomes used for this study were the QDIT-R and the cannabis use frequency score, which was similar to Amanda's. So the QDIT-R is an 8-item validated screener for cannabis use problems with the sum score ranging from 0 to 32. And the cannabis use frequency score was based on an item from the assist, and it was coded 0 to 7, indicating from no use, less than 1 day a month, all the way up to daily. In terms of the statistical analysis, we used linear mixed effects models, which accounted for, again, that within-person variance. And again, we tested age, sex, and baseline cannabis use frequency as moderators, and included ethnicity, marital status, household income, and education as covariates. So just to, before the modeling, just to describe the means of these measures over time. This is for the entire cohort. So you see the overall trend in mean QDIT score over time. And you can see a slight but significant decrease, which really started during COVID and kind of didn't rebound. You can see that kind of line in the middle there. Here you can see the same trend in QDIT stratified by baseline cannabis use frequency, which is, again, one of those moderators that we tested. And, okay, so just to go through the colors, give you guys time to kind of process this. I know it's a lot. So the pink is the daily, and it goes all the way down to the non-users, which is in red-orange. And you can see that the biggest decrease was in that daily group, and there was a slight increase among the non-user group at baseline. And that's kind of to be expected, kind of regression to the mean a little bit. So here it's stratified by age, above and below 30. You can see that relative to baseline, younger people had a slight decline, while the older group stayed about the same. And as Amanda talked about, this could be due to that aging out process, which you typically see in young cannabis users kind of growing out a bit. And finally, with sex, so stratified by sex, I guess the legend there. So the red is males and the blue is females. So there seemed to be probably a more pronounced drop-off, again, in that early COVID period. And then it was sort of parallel over time. Okay, so for the second outcome, and this is cannabis use frequency score. So this is the overall trend. And you can see that the line stays fairly flat over time, with the average kind of remaining under 1 day a month. Okay, and again, stratified by baseline cannabis use frequency. And you can see more movement, obviously, and it's similar to the other outcome. The biggest movement is the decline among those daily users and a slight increase among the non-users. So for stratified by age, we see fairly flat lines with a small decrease in the younger group relative to baseline by the end of it, but they're pretty similar over time. And just to clarify, so the decision to dichotomize at 30 years, under 30 years is typically that when people age out of cannabis use. And stratified by sex, we saw very little movement for either group, pretty parallel over time. Okay, so after visualizing all the data, we ran linear mixed effects models for the two outcomes. We first included a 4-way interaction between time, baseline cannabis use frequency, age, and sex, which thankfully was not significant. And then we did find a significant 3-way interaction between time, baseline cannabis use frequency, and age. So based on those two models, we created interaction plots based on the marginal means estimated from those models. So this is a lot to take in, but this is the visualization of a 3-way interaction within that model. And so on the y-axis, this is for that Q-R score. The x-axis is time in years. And so the left plot, it's stratified by age. So the left plot is under 30 years and right plot is 30 or over. And you can see that there was a downward trend for all baseline cannabis using groups, but especially for the younger frequent users, especially that younger daily user, which had the steepest decline. And we also observed slight but significant increases among that non-user at baseline. And so for the second outcome, cannabis use frequency score, it's fairly similar. Among those less than 30 years of age, there was a downward trend for the groups using cannabis monthly or more at baseline, and a slight upward trend for those using cannabis less than monthly or abstaining at baseline. And among those 30 and over, there was a less pronounced but significant downward trend for those using cannabis weekly or more at baseline, more pronounced decrease for those using monthly, no change for those less than monthly, and a modest but significant increase for those who abstained at baseline. So the overall interpretation is, so at the overall level, so the entire cohort, there was slight but significant decrease in cannabis use problems, but no significant change in cannabis use frequency since legalization. Age and baseline cannabis use frequency moderated these changes, but sex did not. And again, those declines were pronounced in the younger participants using cannabis most frequently at baseline. And again, that's consistent with that aging out pattern. And for both outcomes, there was slight but significant increases among adults not using at baseline. And just a point that it's difficult with the study design to kind of quantify regression to the mean and how much that explains it versus what legalization is explaining. There was only one pre-legalization time point, and unlike beta, we didn't have like a comparison cohort. Okay, for the secondary analyses, so this is looking at cannabis product preferences over time, and we use modified least squares models to estimate prevalence differences. And these analyses were restricted to active cannabis users. So unlike the previous analysis, this didn't take into account the within-person changes. This was just active users at the respective waves if they were endorsing cannabis, not whether they had ever used within the cohort, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of like a quasi-repeated cross-sectional design from a cohort study. So here are the prevalence estimates over time since legalization for all of the products that we looked at. This slide is quite messy and there's a lot of products that we're not as interested in. So I picked out the most interesting trends. And some of these numbers are actually shockingly similar to Dr. Hammond's presentation, especially that decrease in dried flower. So that saw a prevalence difference of minus 0.04. So that means for every additional year in time, the prevalence of dried flower went down by 4%. And we didn't see, unlike the previous presentation, didn't see a significant change in edibles over time. There was sort of a dip, and then it kind of came back to where it was pre-legalization. Interestingly, cannabis oil cartridges, this one was similar to the previous presentation, and disposable vape pens, that increased significantly, as did liquid cannabis products. So the interpretation is that cannabis product preferences appear to be changing over time since legalization. This could be in response to evolving cannabis policy and the availability of new products. And just to go back and point out that the decrease in dried flower and the increase in vaping, from a certain perspective, could be good news for lung health. And that's the end. I'll pass it back to Amanda.
Okay, thank you, Andre. I'm back after a short little break. So now I want to talk to you about something a little bit different, which is changes in attitudes and perceptions since legalization. Why is this important? Well, a lot of folks have been alluding to this all morning, but kind of what we were worried about when legalization was happening and even before legalization started, but when we started to talk about it, was this idea that greater kind of normalization, greater social acceptability, alongside things like increased access, could just increase use in the general population and then increase associated harm. So that was kind of one of the big concerns. And yet, surprisingly, we haven't actually been great at tracking kind of social acceptability of cannabis use in Canada. The US does this pretty robustly, actually, and they've found that over time, and this will probably be surprising to no one, but over time, opinions about cannabis have grown increasingly positive, and opinions about risk have kind of gone in the way that it's less risky. And that's kind of due to obviously a number of reasons, not just one thing. But there have been very few Canadian studies that have looked at this, and obviously post-legalization, this is something that we really do need to be monitoring. So just to give you a little bit of a position, this is the same cohort, or a same cohort study, I should say, that Andre just talked to you about, the PathCan cohort. The sample is slightly different. I'm going to show you data from 9 time points up to October 2022, so pretty recent. Contrary to my last presentation, this is actually kind of a general community sample, so 18 to 65, and did not have that kind of high substance use enrollment criteria. This was about 1,100 individuals tracked over those 9 time points, and these are just people who had data at all of those 9 time points. Again, same people over time. We looked at perceptions of cannabis use, the social acceptability across a few different domains that I'll kind of explain further in a bit, and same with safety. Something else that was done was we also asked people what their opinion was about legalization, and I'll show you that in a minute as well. The modeling approach is similar. It's generalized linear mixed models this time because the outcome was ordinal, and all that means is that when we asked people about things like social acceptability and safety, it was just on like a Likert scale. So not always the same number of items, but think of a scale from like completely unacceptable to completely acceptable. So we would ask someone, you know, what's your opinion on people using cannabis regularly for recreational purposes? And they would rate that on a scale from kind of completely unacceptable, somewhat unacceptable, etc. And we, I should mention this, we controlled in all the models for sex, age, ethnicity, and income. I want to start by positioning the social acceptability of cannabis over time compared to other substances. So I don't know if you can read this, but the mint kind of color line at the very top, that's regular medical cannabis use. So that kind of was the most acceptable of all of the substance use behaviors. Not particularly surprising because of the medical context. What is a little bit surprising is that it actually went down a bit over time, so it became less acceptable over time to people. Next was regular alcohol use, followed by trying cannabis once or twice. We just asked people, what do you think of others trying cannabis once or twice? And so we can kind of call that like the experimentation. What do you think of cannabis experimentation? And then after that was regular recreational cannabis use. So they were all, I'll point out just based on the scale, they were all kind of acceptable, right? So I put a dotted line there, that's neutral. Anything that dips below neutral, people rated as unacceptable. So you can see that for tobacco and e-cigarette use, people didn't have as positive perceptions of that. They actually, on average, rated them as somewhat unacceptable or quite unacceptable. So that's just position. This is just kind of means positioning where is cannabis in reference to other substance use behaviors. Now I mentioned, don't worry, you won't have to look at this slide for long. I mentioned these were ordinal generalized linear mixed models. I'm showing you this just for a minute to say that if we want to talk about kind of the specific numbers, I do have them if you want to ask a question or come up to me after. But I find that talking over an odds ratio table like this tends to put people to sleep. So I'm going to simplify it quite a bit. So this is a kind of a translation of those numbers. So when we talk about social acceptability, what happened? Well, over time, people's opinions on regular recreational cannabis use got more positive over time, so they thought it was more acceptable. Opposite for medical use. Again, I found this a bit surprising. People were kind of less approving of regular cannabis use for medical purposes over time. We're not too sure why that is at the moment. If you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. They were increasingly approving of trying cannabis once or twice, so that kind of corresponds with recreational use. And then just to give you context, regular alcohol use and regular e-cigarette use was less acceptable over time. And then the baseline cannabis use column just tells us how did people who used cannabis at the beginning of this study sample, how did they respond differently from people who didn't? And somewhat not surprisingly, everyone who used cannabis at baseline tended to have higher or like more acceptable opinions of all of the substance use behaviors. There's a little bit more nuance to this story because we did actually find significant interaction terms. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what that means. And kind of I'm showing you this because there's kind of an interesting conclusion here. So if you look at the top panel, regular cannabis use for recreational purposes, what I've done here is I've divided the categories by people who didn't use cannabis at baseline and people who did. So the red line is people who didn't use cannabis at baseline. So what's interesting is if you look at this panel that I just highlighted, they are less likely to say that it's somewhat unacceptable over time, and they're more likely to say that it's somewhat acceptable. So if I'm to translate that for you, it looks like people who didn't use cannabis at the outset of the study are actually the ones driving the increase in more positive like perceptions, like greater social acceptability, which is a little bit opposite to what we might think, right? And we see the same thing for trying cannabis once or twice. So they're less likely to rate it as that neutral category, and they're more likely to rate it as somewhat approved. So they're kind of shifting their opinions to be more positive over time, even though they're not the ones that were using cannabis at baseline in our sample. So that's pretty interesting. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, and then they're also more likely to rate it as strongly approved, as well as somewhat approved. So they're shifting kind of to the right. I also want to talk to you about our safety measures. So this is a little bit more confusing to interpret just because not everything is measured on the same scale. But in terms of addictiveness of cannabis, so cannabis in terms of how addictive it was perceived as less safe over time or more addictive. I know that's a little bit confusing, but essentially people over time perceive cannabis as more addictive. They also saw it as less safe over time compared to driving under the influence of alcohol. So when we ask people, how do you feel about driving under the influence of cannabis compared to driving under the influence of alcohol, and over time they were more likely to say, oh, it's less safe than driving under the influence of alcohol. What's interesting, so the safety compared to alcohol consumption increased over time. So people, this is again not surprising, this is consistent to the US research that shows that people kind of tend to decrease their risk perception of cannabis over time. In our sample, when we asked people, how do you feel about cannabis compared to alcohol, they said, oh, it's kind of more safe over time. The interesting one, and perhaps the most concerning one, is the safety during pregnancy, which significantly increased over time. So people thought that cannabis was safer over time in context of people using it while pregnant. So that's obviously a concern. We don't kind of want people using during pregnancy. So this is definitely, again, I'm probably going to sound like a broken record here, but something that we need to keep monitoring and kind of keep taking a look at. I want to highlight that we see a similar pattern that we saw with the social acceptability stuff. So people not using cannabis at baseline were less likely to say, oh yeah, it's somewhat less safe than alcohol, and they're more likely to say that it's equally safe. I show you these figures also to highlight that when I talk about increasing safety perception or decreasing social acceptability and stuff like that, it's not like I'm only talking about people who are going from, oh yeah, it's much less safe to it's much safer, or like the extreme end. Sometimes it's just one jump up in category, but still kind of a shift in perspective. And that's why we're looking at it in this way, because perspectives obviously change more gradually over time, typically. The opposite is kind of happening with driving impairment. So if you look at people who did use cannabis at baseline, that's the blue line or the teal line, they were more likely to say that it was equally safe over time and less likely to say that it was somewhat safer. So that's kind of interesting that people who used cannabis are kind of rating it as less safe over time in terms of driving. So if I'm gonna kind of sum all that up for you in a moment, but first I wanna just briefly chat about legalization. So we asked from time 2 to time 4, so time 2 being April 2019, time 4 being April 2020, what people's opinions were about cannabis legalization in Canada, whether they thought it was a very bad idea or a very good idea or somewhere in between. And this is how people transitioned. And really the story here is that over time, people kind of thought it was a good idea, and more people went to the good idea categories than the bad idea categories. So you can kind of see those, the red and the yellow bars decreasing in size over time. And the generalized linear mixed models support this too. So this is just descriptive on the left, but the model actually supports this as well, that people have increasingly positive opinions of legalization over these kind of 3 time points. So let me try my best to sum up all of that information for you. So with social acceptability, we saw increasingly acceptable perceptions of regular recreational cannabis use and experimenting with cannabis, but we saw decreasing acceptability for regular medical use. Again, a little bit perplexing. And it looks like the people who are shifting their perspectives the most are actually the ones that weren't using cannabis at baseline. For safety, Things that were perceived as safer over time was use during pregnancy. Again, we're definitely worried about that one. And use compared to alcohol consumption. But it was perceived as more addictive over time. It was also perceived as less safe compared to driving under the influence of alcohol. And we see kind of a similar pattern that we saw with social acceptability, where the people who are not using cannabis at baseline tend to have kind of more positive perceptions than their counterparts. Legalization is a bit of a simpler story. People just were more approving of it over time. And I will leave it at that. Thank you, everybody, for listening to our presentations, and we're happy to take any questions. And you can ask either of us a question or both of us about any of the presentations. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
A lot of the work that you've done does seem to speak to some of the same issues that Professor Hammond's talked. If you had to sort of synchronize his findings with yours, I mean, is there an overall arching message you could give about the best estimate of the association of legalization and patterns of use?
That is an excellent question. I will take first crack at that. So I will say, with the caveat that we're talking about general population here, or kind of, in my case, in the first presentation, emerging adults, we're not talking about like specific like clinical populations or anything like that. What I would say is, to summarize, we didn't see like crazy, like substantive increases when legalization happens. It wasn't like October 2017 and everyone was like, yeah, I'm gonna try cannabis and keep using it. Like, that's not what happened. What I will say from kind of Dave's evidence and our evidence is there is an increased uptick in people using cannabis, at least kind of in our category. It was just people who weren't using pre-legalization. There was that increase. Whether or not legalization precipitated that, it's kind of hard to say, especially because legalization wasn't really one event, right? Like, yes, there is a date to it, and we put that line on our graphs and everything, but realistically, it was kind of a long going event, right? Like, conversations about legalization started to happen. And then the act was passed, but there wasn't really a whole lot after that. That day happened, and then everyone was like, okay. And then storefronts started going up and stuff like that. So all that to say, in Canada, it doesn't look like we've had any kind of major issues in terms of general population cannabis use, but there are definitely subgroups of people that we should probably still be keeping an eye on. If I had to summarize, that would be my answer to that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Andre.
You said a lot of what I was going to say. Just to add, the ICPS was designed to be representative, and these cohorts maybe aren't as representative. They're more community cohorts. So it's a little difficult, but you can see some of the trends were quite similar, especially cannabis products. Yeah.
Yeah, Jay.
Is this thing on? Yes, it is. Great presentations from both of you. Andre, I want to kind of give you a chance to sort of unpack a bit your last comment about potential impacts on lung health, but I also want to tie in Amanda's efforts at level setting, context with tobacco smoke and perceptions on tobacco smoke. And you demonstrated that, and other people are showing this drop in combustion of cannabis flower.
Not necessarily combustion, it was just dried flower.
Dried flower, sorry.
So
that's my bias of assuming it's combustion.
But that's why I said that provocative thing, yeah.
And do you have corresponding data on tobacco use in that group to level set the way Amanda did, to see if actually there's just an overall drop in, I'm assuming, combustion here, that actually isn't necessarily leading to the transition to vaping, but it's just an overall perception in the population that combusting anything and inhaling anything might be bad. Do you have the ability to do that with your data, and do you think that would help you kind of unpack if there is this switch between consumption? paths?
I would have to look at the data set. I can't, off the top of my head, tell you whether we have that kind of data. I don't know if others who work with the data know, but
I'm not going to answer your question directly, Jay, but I actually do have a comment on that. So not with the data that I've presented today, but from my PhD cohort, which you'll hear about with Scott's presentation after this, among youth, we actually did a project where we looked at modes of use and like change over time. And what we found is that when you look descriptively, yes, there's a decrease in kind of dried flower use, but when you look at different modes of consumption and you kind of control for the fact that people can be using multi-modes, at least in that youth sample, what we found was that it was less that people were stopping dried flower use and more that they were just adding on other things. So in our kind of Compass youth sample, that's what we found, is that, yeah, when we look at kind of the numbers, it might be like, it might look good in terms of public health, but then when we actually kind of do the math and look at all the combinations of categories, what it actually looks like is that youth are kind of adding on to their existing use. Not to say that, I mean, everybody is doing that, but it was a pattern that we saw. So we saw that people were adding kind of edibles onto their category of use rather than swapping. So it was more of an addition rather than a swap.
Okay. My simple brain is, can only do swap. It's one or the other, but I recognize it's complex. Thank you.
We do have one online question. So can you say from the data that there is an increase in acceptance of medical cannabis for those that were assessed? Sorry if I missed that.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you say from the data that there was an increase in acceptance of medical cannabis by those who were assessed?
No, there was a decrease, which is interesting. So there was a decrease in kind of opinions of use of cannabis for medical purposes over time.